Calm children aren't born. They're built, quietly, over years, by adults who never announced they were doing it. And there is a very specific difference between those two explanations. Born calm means it's temperament, luck, something you either have or don't. Built calm means it's environment, specific, ordinary conditions, repeated so consistently that a child's nervous system simply never learns to expect the alternative. 6 reasons. None of them are about strict discipline in the way that word usually gets used. And together they explain a scene most visitors to Japan eventually notice and can't quite explain: a toddler sitting quietly through a long train ride, a young child waiting patiently in a restaurant, without a phone, without a meltdown, without a single adult raising their voice to make it happen. Before we go further, every child is different, temperament varies, and nothing here is a guarantee or a judgment of any parent's approach. This is about the environmental patterns researchers and observers have consistently pointed to, not a claim that any single child or family is doing something wrong. Stay with me until reason number 6, because number 6 is the one that ties the other 5 together. The reason this isn't really about any single technique, but about one consistent environment a child never has to adjust to twice. But first, reason number 3 is the one that's going to surprise you, because it's not really about calming a child down at all. It's about something most Western parenting instinctively does the opposite of, and it might be the single biggest factor on this entire list. Let's begin. Most of us think about a calm child the wrong way. We assume it's either temperament, some kids are just naturally easygoing, or the result of strict rules and consequences, a child who's calm because they're afraid not to be. Neither explanation matches what researchers who've actually studied this closely tend to find. What consistently shows up instead is environmental predictability and modeling. A child's nervous system calibrates, over years, to whatever pattern of adult behavior and daily structure surrounds it most consistently. There's a concept in Japanese parenting culture, shitsuke, sometimes translated as discipline but closer in meaning to the quiet, ongoing shaping of behavior through consistent example and gentle correction rather than through punishment or reward. And there's the broader idea of a specific, culturally recognized form of secure dependence between a child and caregiver, where the child's trust that their needs will be met reliably is treated as the actual foundation calm behavior gets built on top of, not something in tension with it. 6 reasons. Each one an environmental condition, not a personality trait. Each one something that, repeated daily for years, quietly shapes what a child comes to expect from public spaces and from their own ability to handle them. Let's go through every single one. You've probably assumed a child's temperament in public is mostly fixed. Some kids are wired to be calm, others aren't, and there's only so much a parent can do about it either way. Stay with me, because a huge body of developmental research points somewhere different. Predictability, not temperament alone, is one of the strongest predictors of a young child's capacity to self-regulate in unfamiliar or overstimulating settings. Here's the mechanism. Young children have limited capacity to manage uncertainty, an unpredictable schedule, inconsistent routines, and unclear expectations all place additional cognitive and emotional load on a developing nervous system that's already working hard just to process a normal day. Research on child development consistently finds that children raised with highly predictable daily rhythms, consistent meal times, consistent nap schedules, consistent routines around transitions, develop stronger self-regulation earlier, in part because their nervous system isn't spending energy managing uncertainty about what comes next, freeing up capacity to manage the actual moment they're in. Japanese childcare culture, both at home and in early education settings, places notable emphasis on highly consistent daily structure from a very young age, the same rhythm, largely unchanged, day after day. A child raised this way doesn't need externally imposed calm in public. Their baseline nervous system state already has less uncertainty to manage in the first place. The shift, the same child, raised with a highly consistent daily rhythm instead of a loosely structured one, enters an unfamiliar public setting with meaningfully more regulatory capacity already available, not because the child is inherently calmer, but because less of that capacity has already been spent managing an unpredictable day. That is reason number 1. Now, reason number 2 is where this gets interesting, because it's less about the child at all and more about who's standing next to them. Most parenting advice focused on a child's behavior in public centers on what to tell the child, instructions, reminders, rules about how to act. Developmental research on emotional regulation points to something that matters considerably more than verbal instruction, the observed emotional state of the adults around the child, moment to moment, in real time. Here's the mechanism. This is called co-regulation. A young child's nervous system doesn't yet have a fully developed capacity to self-regulate independently, and instead borrows regulation from the adults nearby, largely through nonverbal cues, tone of voice, facial expression, body tension, the pace of an adult's movements. A child surrounded by adults who remain visibly calm during a stressful or overstimulating moment tends to co-regulate toward that calm state, almost involuntarily. A child surrounded by adults who become visibly stressed, rushed, or reactive during the same moment tends to escalate alongside them, for the same underlying reason. Public composure, broadly modeled across Japanese adult behavior, the visibly unhurried pace, the quiet restraint even in crowded or delayed situations, isn't separate from how calmly children in that environment tend to behave. It's a large part of the actual mechanism producing it. Children aren't simply told to be calm in public. They're surrounded, constantly, by an adult baseline that quietly demonstrates what calm in that exact setting actually looks like. The shift, the same overstimulating public moment, a delayed train, a crowded space, produces a completely different response in a child depending almost entirely on the visible emotional state of the nearest adult, because the child's own nervous system is, in that moment, largely borrowing its cues from that adult's. That is reason number 2. Now, reason number 3, the one I mentioned at the very beginning. Stay right here, because this one goes directly against a common Western parenting instinct. Slow down here, because I know what you're thinking, that letting a child sit with frustration, even briefly, sounds like the opposite of good parenting. Here's what developmental research on frustration tolerance has consistently found, and why this specific habit may be doing more work than any single item on this list. Here's the mechanism. Self-regulation is a skill built through repeated, manageable exposure to mild frustration, not avoided, resolved instantly by an adult every single time it appears. A child who never experiences a small, tolerable amount of boredom, delay, or minor discomfort without immediate adult intervention doesn't get the repeated practice needed to develop their own internal capacity to sit with those feelings. Research on frustration tolerance in early childhood has found that children given developmentally appropriate opportunities to experience and move through small frustrations independently, rather than having every instance immediately resolved for them, show measurably stronger self-regulation in later childhood than children whose frustration was consistently, immediately intercepted. This connects to a broader pattern in Japanese parenting culture that tends to allow more space for a child to sit briefly with boredom or mild discomfort, on a train, in a waiting room, without an adult immediately reaching for a phone, a snack, or a distraction the instant the child shows the first sign of restlessness. The frustration isn't ignored. It's simply not treated as an emergency requiring instant resolution. The shift, the same moment of a child's boredom on a train, immediately resolved with a phone or a snack every single time versus allowed to exist briefly and pass on its own, produces two very different long-term outcomes, one where the child never has to develop their own tolerance for the feeling, and one where they repeatedly practice, in small manageable doses, that the feeling is survivable and temporary. That is reason number 3. Now, reason number 4, and this one is about how public space itself gets framed to a child from a very early age. This isn't communicated through strict punishment. It's communicated through consistent, early, gentle framing, repeated so often, so early, that it becomes an internalized expectation rather than an externally enforced rule. Here's the mechanism. Children absorb social norms primarily through repeated, consistent modeling and gentle correction, well before they're capable of fully understanding the reasoning behind a rule. A norm reinforced consistently across nearly every public setting a child experiences, trains, restaurants, waiting rooms, becomes, over time, simply how things are, rather than a rule the child is actively resisting or complying with under pressure. Research on norm internalization in early childhood has found that consistently, gently reinforced expectations, applied the same way across many different contexts, are internalized far more durably than the same expectation enforced inconsistently or only through strict, occasional discipline. Japanese public culture reinforces quiet, considerate behavior in shared spaces with unusual consistency across nearly every context a young child encounters, which means the child isn't managing a special public behavior mode they have to consciously activate. It's simply the only mode they've ever consistently experienced in those settings. The shift, the same expectation of quiet in public, reinforced consistently across every shared space a child experiences versus enforced only occasionally or inconsistently, becomes an internalized default in the first case and a rule to actively resist or forget in the second. That is reason number 4. Now, reason number 5, and this one involves something that often surprises Western observers specifically. Japan is well known for a cultural pattern where children, sometimes as young as 6 or 7, are given small independent responsibilities, running a short errand alone, taking public transportation to school without an accompanying adult, under conditions considered generally safe within their specific community context. Here's the mechanism behind why this connects to public comm specifically. Developmental research on autonomy and self-regulation has found a consistent relationship between age-appropriate independence and a child's confidence in managing their own behavior without constant external oversight. A child regularly given small, genuine responsibility develops an internalized sense of competence, the belief that they are capable of managing themselves in a given setting, that a child who is never given this kind of independence doesn't have the same opportunity to build. This internalized competence shows up directly in public behavior. A child who trusts their own capability to navigate a public space tends to be measurably calmer within it than a child who has only ever experienced public spaces as something entirely managed and controlled by a hovering adult. The shift, the same public setting is experienced completely differently by a child who has some internalized sense of their own competence to navigate it, versus a child who has never been given the chance to build that sense at all, and that difference in internal experience shows up, externally, as a difference in observable calm. That is reason number 5. Now, reason number 6, the one I told you at the very start, ties all 5 of the others together. Stay here, because this is the most important thing in this entire video. This last reason isn't a separate factor. It's the condition that determines whether the previous 5 function as a genuine, internalized environment for a child, or as a set of inconsistent rules that only apply in some settings and not others. Here's what I mean. A child who experiences predictable structure, calm adult modeling, tolerable frustration, quiet public norms, and age-appropriate independence at home, but experiences the complete opposite at daycare, or with grandparents, or in public more generally, doesn't get to internalize any of it as a stable expectation. Children's behavior adapts context by context when the environment itself is inconsistent, calm in one setting, different in another, because the child has correctly learned that the rules genuinely do change depending on where they are and who's present. What tends to differ in a culture where this pattern is broadly consistent is that a child experiences roughly the same 5 conditions almost everywhere, at home, in early education settings, in public, with the vast majority of adults they regularly encounter. This consistency is what allows a child to internalize the pattern as simply how the world works, rather than as a set of context-dependent rules that only apply under certain adult supervision. The shift, the same 5 environmental conditions, applied consistently by one caregiver but inconsistently everywhere else a child spends time, produce a context-dependent, situational calm at best. Applied consistently across nearly every setting and caregiver a child regularly encounters, the same 5 conditions produce something closer to an internalized baseline, calm not because the child is being managed in this particular moment, but because this is simply what every moment has consistently taught them to expect. That is reason number 6. Here is everything in one breath. A predictable daily structure that reduces how much uncertainty a child has to manage. Consistent adult modeling of calm that the child's own nervous system co-regulates toward. Small, tolerable frustrations allowed to exist and pass, rather than immediately resolved every single time. Public space consistently framed, early and gently, as a shared space requiring mutual quiet. Age-appropriate independence, introduced early enough to build genuine internalized competence. And all 5 applied consistently across nearly every setting and caregiver a child encounters, not just at home. None of this is about strict discipline, punishment, or a child suppressing their natural feelings to perform calm for an audience. It's about an environment consistent enough that a child's nervous system never has to learn a different, more anxious pattern in the first place. Calm children in public aren't the product of a single clever parenting trick, and they're not simply lucky temperament either. They're the product of an environment repeated so consistently, across so many ordinary days, that calm quietly became the only pattern the child ever really learned. So here's what I want from you before you close this video. If you're a parent, tell me in the comments which one of these 6 resonates most with your own experience, or which one feels hardest to actually put into practice given your own daily life? Is it number 3, do you find yourself rushing to resolve every small frustration the moment it appears? Is it number 6, is your child's environment fairly consistent, or does it look completely different from one setting or caregiver to the next? Tell me which number stood out to you in the comments right now, because naming it is often the first step toward actually changing it, and someone reading your comment might recognize their own family's pattern in it. If this gave you a new way of thinking about calm, considerate kids, send it to another parent in your life who's navigated their own version of the same public meltdown you have. There's real research and real, ordinary environmental patterns behind what looks, from the outside, like something children in some places were simply born with. I'll see you in the next one.